And we're not even done yet, because besides all this, an invasion is still very unlikely for another reason: the Pentagon's unrivaled resources.
Alright y'all, welcome back to Combat Arms channel. Alright, so today we're checking out something that I have been seeing on YouTube all over the place, mostly with a lot of people doing reaction videos too. Now, I haven't watched it in its entirety, but it looks really interesting and it's got to be pretty good if there's a lot of people doing reactions to it. So I guess I'm kind of just jumping on that bandwagon as well. Now, we'll say the title is a little bit clickbaity, but it does have 4.5 million views in like 5 months. So it's doing pretty good. But the title is US Enemies Are Not Gonna Like This Video. So I'm guessing it's kind of just going to go over like the US military might, kind of like going over the budgets and maybe kind of the equipment, and also maybe like how we have like a footprint in a lot of different countries or something. But yeah, I don't know. Should be interesting. I don't know if it's as interesting coming from like an American perspective doing a reaction to it. But yeah, should be cool nonetheless. So let's check it out.
Look at this chart. It compares military budgets of countries, but it's a bit different, because it doesn't compare one country's military spending to another, but instead compares the US's military spending with the cumulative total of the 9 other countries' military spending. We're all on the top 10 list of biggest spenders. The reason? Well, the United States spent over $800 billion on its military in 2021, thus outspending South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Russia, the UK, India, and China combined. So there's frankly no worthwhile comparison to be made here. Yet still, after fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and after a trade war with China, as well as unfriendly relations with Iran and North Korea, the US has its fair share of enemies who undoubtedly want to hurt them in one way, shape, or form. So, hypothetically speaking, despite such a well-equipped military, could an enemy ever successfully invade the US or make devastating damages to the nation in—
Oh, what was that? Like, kind of like a little— I wouldn't say, it doesn't look like air stuff. I guess maybe like some kind of militia footage or whatnot. Yeah, pretty cool. Again, so another country invading the US is a very interesting topic because, and I think there's like a quote from like World War II from like one of the Japanese commanders or whatnot, saying that there's going to be like so many guns, like a gun behind like every blade of grass. I'm not sure if I'm attributing that to the right person, but there's going to be like so many guns, like it's going to be pretty gnarly. Like, yeah, you can invade, but because there's so many guns, like even the people themselves are their own kind of military, and yeah, it's gonna make it pretty difficult. So unless you can get some like serious hardware actually on the land itself, which means like no air force, like air superiority, naval superiority, all of that, then it's going to be kind of difficult to really, you know, land forces or infantry and kind of move through the country like that, because probably not going to work out too well.
Ever successfully invade the US or make devastating damages to the nation in some way? Well, as it turns out, this question was a bit harder to answer than I initially planned, because the military is only one of the reasons why the US is so unconquerable. You see, the US is in an incredible position geographically, and its secret weapon might therefore be its location.
The water,
all you have to do is look at this map to understand
and
why.
It's super
For
far
over
away.
150 years, America's territory has stretched all the way across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. These huge coasts separate the US from any potential enemy. So even in wartime, the American mainland is very well protected. Take World War II for example, when America fought in both Europe and Asia at the same time. Barely any attacks happened on US soil during the entire war. That meant American factories could keep making planes and weapons without interruptions, unlike the constantly bombed Soviet and British factories. On top of that, the Defense Production Act allowed the president to allocate materials and facilities for national defense, direct companies to prioritize government orders, and offer loans to companies to make this happen fast. In 2020, this law was used to increase the production of ventilators and medical grade masks. So clearly, it's—
Wait, the same law was used to increase the production of ventilators and masks? But it's pretty cool to think that it's like that versatile, that you can transform this old World War II policy into something like that.
Clearly, it's a very useful law to have in the toolbox, since the US still has a domestic industrial base with major shipyards, aviation, and automotive factories. A wartime scenario could easily involve switching to wartime production, so this makes sense. Not to mention the existing military industry, which is already making tanks, planes, weapons, and warships for the US military. Factories on US soil are a huge advantage, because the US military can protect its supply chain simply by defending its own territory. Very little has to come from outside compared to its enemies, who would need to constantly run supplies across an entire ocean. I mean, just look at the size of the Atlantic Ocean and the even bigger Pacific to get an idea of just how long enemy supply chains would have to be. Not to mention the fact that with today's satellites, it would be trivially easy to spot an invasion coming from thousands of miles away and take.
And the fact that, like, I think we've done a pretty good job with setting our framework up, or setting up our just general national framework up to support the military pretty well. Like GPS is a great example. Like you have other GPS systems like GLONASS, and I forgot what the Chinese one was, but yeah, they're not like set up. They're set up pretty well, but the US did a pretty good job where, like, a while ago they sort of allowed these military satellites, or these GPS satellites, I think I'm saying this correctly, but they basically commercialized them. Like they kind of opened it to the public, so it had like more purposes and more uses. And I think it also kind of just helped increase the security infrastructure as well. I'm not sure, you guys might know a little bit more about it, but I've heard like a little bit of bits and pieces about how the US was kind of strategic and how they were setting up the GPS. Because you can understand GPS is pretty important when it comes to like any sort of military operation.
Take out enemy shipments before they ever reached the US coast. Supply lines are critical in any war, and the US military is well known for its excellent logistics capabilities. They have the added advantage of the 45,000-mile highway system, which was designed with troop movements in mind. On top of that, the US has 140,000 miles of freight railway infrastructure. Now sure, this can be a double-edged sword, as enemies could use this infrastructure to penetrate into America's heartland. And infrastructure could definitely be a weak point, if not probably guarded. A good example of this would be this pipeline that runs over 5,500 miles from Texas to New Jersey and carries nearly 45% of the East Coast's fuel supply. In May 2021, a cyber attack shut down the pipeline for 5 days, and this isn't a fluke either. China and Russia both support cybercrime groups that regularly attack government agencies and companies.
Yeah, they do.
The former head lawyer for the NSA, Stuart Baker, told the Washington Post, quote, "We're fighting the cyber equivalent of a land war in Asia every day. But America's infrastructure is more than just highways and internet cables. Back in the day, another kind of highway already connected the Midwest from north to south, the Mississippi River, and the connected Missouri River is the fourth."
It's kind of interesting how they're going like so in depth into all these different modes of transportation. Again, people don't really understand, like, I mean, looking from the outside in, it sounds like it makes sense. Like, yeah, of course you need people to be able to supply it, but there's a lot of things like naturally that you can take advantage of as well, like these rivers. But yeah, again, I don't know if necessarily like all the railroads and whatnot were, of course, when you had like the Manifest Destiny and the US was just expanding west, they were trying to expand all that so they can kind of push resources. But of course, it does work pretty well for the military. So I'm not sure if it was necessarily worked in exactly to be, you know, kind of like military focused. But at this point, it doesn't really matter because, again, all that infrastructure is there and it is being used for those purposes like every day.
Longest river system in the world. So yeah, this river has always been crucial to connecting the economies of major cities like New Orleans, Minneapolis, and St. Louis. Today, the river is still used to ship goods across America. So during an invasion, the Mississippi could likely help move troops and weapons too. What's impressive about the US's geography is how challenging it makes the US to conquer. And that might have to do with the diversity of terrains like deserts, swamps, and mountains. The Appalachian Mountains in the east and the Rocky Mountains in the west serve as major barriers to inland invasion, and the Great Lakes in the northeast form yet another barrier. The result is that the flatter areas along the southern border seem like the best entry point. But the US compensates for these weaknesses with huge numbers of troops stationed in California and Texas. The coasts aren't any easier to invade with hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in military bases.
And I wonder if they're going to talk about it, but you also need to consider, like, and this is kind of like a topic that a lot of Europeans might see come up for America, but like our police, our border patrol, we have a lot of different agencies with a lot of like pretty solid equipment and capabilities as well, kind of like organic to their own agencies. And you have to think like, yeah, not necessarily the military is there, of course, on the southern border, but you also have a lot of other agencies that have a lot of infrastructure already built up, not necessarily to defend against a land invasion on that kind of scale. But again, it's things to consider. It's like we have some lessons learned as far as how to have better coverage of certain areas like
Not
that.
to mention the fact that the US has peaceful relations with its neighbors to the north and south, which both have smaller populations and militaries if any turmoil was to unfold. To the east and west, the US has no neighbors as previously discussed, a fact which has led America to focus on other things instead of imminent invasions. On top of that, the NATO treaty requires European and Canadian allies to come to America's defense if it's ever attacked. Oh yeah, and in addition to its current military personnel, the US still maintains the selective service system. See, all males from 18 to 25 have to sign up for a lottery to be drafted in the case of a national emergency. During the height of World War II, the US drafted over 3 million men per year. So this system could potentially expand the US's military personnel by
Again, I didn't know it was that high.
And we're not even done yet, because besides all this, an invasion is still very unlikely for another reason. The Pentagon's unrivaled resources. As I mentioned in the beginning, the US's defense budget is unrivaled.
Stupid amount
the
of
US
money.
spent almost 3 times as much as China in 2021 and 10 times more than Russia.
I can't
The
even
result
fathom
is
that.
that no country has enough ships or planes to get past the US forces. According to one military expert, quote, "The amphibious assault capability of the combined militaries of the world are simply too insignificant to get a beachhead on a coast." And then we of course have the civilians, who have even more guns than the military. So maybe armed citizens could also join the fight against invaders. I mean, it's a possibility. But anyway, urban warfare.
Again, like you wouldn't necessarily consider like these types of weapons, but again, like if you're just, you know, like a weary squad or platoon trying to, you know, roll into somebody's neighborhood and kind of just take over their house just so you can set up like a patrol base or whatnot. But all of a sudden, everybody inside the house has one of these and they're pointing it outside the windows and they're blasting it at you. You're not going to be able to get anything done. And it's just going to really, really slow your efforts. But of course, you can imagine like a land invasion of the US is probably not going to happen like right away at all. You might have like some onesies and twosies, kind of like special operations stuff. But like them trying to push a land invasion is not going to happen until like we're severely crippled for, you know, whatever reason.
Urban warfare presents more challenges than fighting in open combat and often gives an advantage to the country defending its own territory. We only have to look at Russia's failed invasion of Kiev for proof of this factor. While urban areas make up a small amount of US territory, any invader would have to take control of cities to conquer the country, since 82% of the population lives in these cities. Another advantage of armies defending their own country from invasion is the will to fight. According to the RAND Corporation, a think tank closely tied to the Pentagon, will to fight means the disposition and decision to fight, to keep fighting, and to win.
Or
the report
Sisu,
highlights the
as the Finns
times
say.
will to fight was emphasized in US military doctrine, demonstrating just how vital it is to military victories. You can clearly see how that influenced the outcome of World War II and the Vietnam War. When a country is invaded, like Vietnam was, it's natural
Americans
that the invaded country
love
is
war
more
in a weird
motivated to
way.
defend its land.
Can't stay away from
I think it's
it.
safe to assume the same would apply during an invasion of the US. But let's shift gears for a bit and discuss.
Especially when you're talking about like an invasion, talking about like the global war on terror, Americans for the most part were pretty well in support of that for a few different reasons. A few different things that kind of fed into that happening, some with a little bit more justification than others. But again, like talking about an invasion, like that's going to have like full American support, which is a pretty scary thing because that only happens like a few times, especially like World War II is a great example. And when you have like that much support, everybody rallying for that effort, it is a crazy intense thing to see. And just like we kind of see with like the Russian invasion, their will to fight is not nearly as high as you have like the Ukrainians. And that's definitely taken them very far.
There's one enormous US advantage I haven't mentioned, which is self-reliance for its food, energy, and weapons needs. Take these green areas for example. This land is mostly used for agriculture since only 2% of America's land is in urban areas. This low-lying land is a major reason why the US is nearly self-sufficient in agriculture and even exports food to many countries around the world. It also explains why America now actually has the most arable land in the world. That's right, the US has more arable land than India, and China. What's more surprising is that India is only a third the size of the US, and China is slightly smaller but can only sustain large populations near its east coast. The crazy thing is that both of those countries have over 1.3 billion people, or about 1 billion more than the US population. And since the US is only projected to grow by another 100 million people over the next century, the US likely has enough resources to support a billion-plus population, but they don't need to. As for energy, the US also has impressive amounts of petroleum and gas, especially in parts of Texas. It has around 44 billion barrels of proved crude oil reserves and almost 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves.
Sounds like a lot.
In fact,
I'm not sure
when you
though.
include biofuels, the US could be considered the largest oil producer in the world. It seems like even the bad parts of US geography have a major silver lining. The Appalachian Mountains on the east coast that I mentioned earlier aren't suited for farming, but they do have huge coal deposits that have been exploited for decades. And surprisingly, at least to me, America has the world's largest coal reserves and loads of other natural resources.
Coal reserves? I didn't
energy
even know
to
that was a
metals.
thing.
But to share a bit of a weakness of the US, it turns out it doesn't have every metal it needs to defend itself. You see, this shiny looking rock is a mineral called antimony, and is critical for making bullets and other weapons, and even night vision goggles. Well, antimony played an important role in World War II ammunition production.
Night vision goggles. I mean, maybe on like, I don't even know. Maybe in like some of the circuitry, or maybe like part of the films. I don't know. That's kind of interesting. But actually, like bullets and rounds and whatnot, I need to look that up. I need to look up that metal and see how it kind of plays into those, because I've never even heard of it, to be honest.
The last mine in the US closed in 1997. The US is therefore reliant on China and Russia, its two biggest military rivals, for supply of this critical mineral. So the US does have weaknesses, but who could actually have the military might and, most importantly, motivation to try and invade the US? Well, the latest US defense strategy names the People's Republic of China as the US's most consequential strategic competitor, and notes that Russia poses acute threats. Beyond these two big threats, it also mentions North Korea and Iran. But let's focus on China for a bit. It's true that China is slowly building up its military capabilities, but it isn't even ready to launch an invasion on the island of Taiwan, let alone
That dude's in a labor camp somewhere now. Okay, but talking about that, another thing that I know China is good with, specifically talking from the intelligence side, is they do a really good job of stealing other people's work. As far as, you know, a lot of people will spend a lot of money on research and development. China has a lot of efforts focused on that. So as opposed to us, you know, dishing out billions and billions to try and develop this stuff, and then China kind of just coming in and just taking a lot of that information and kind of using it, they save a lot of money on that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things that a lot of people don't consider, as far as like, yeah, we're spending a lot of stuff, or we're spending a lot of money on our military, but a lot of that is kind of being undermined by some of those efforts as well.
The west coast of the United States. I don't think I even need to mention how the loss of its largest trading partner would devastate the Chinese economy. Still, there's some reason for concern. If China disabled American satellites, it could debilitate the US military's ability to monitor troop movements in real time. If you're thinking this sounds like science fiction though, you'd be wrong, because in 2007, China successfully destroyed one of its own satellites with a ballistic missile. Floating 850 kilometers above the Earth, the destroyed satellite is at a similar altitude to US intelligence satellites. So China could theoretically destroy them too.
Yeah, now warfare is really focusing on like the sort of multi-domain operations aspect. Like, it's not just land operations, it's cyber, it's electronic warfare. There's a lot of things going into war now, and space is just one massive aspect that you need to consider. And, you know, that's why we have a space force now. Like, it's definitely a big deal, and it's going to continue to stay a big deal in the future.
In terms of Russia, well, they have now performed a similar test, which endangered the crew of the ISS. Taking out satellites is a bit extreme though, because it causes hazardous space debris that would affect all current and future satellites. That includes Russia's and China's satellites. But Russia and China are already interfering with US satellites on a daily basis. They're just using lasers and jammers instead of trying to shoot them down. What's even scarier though is China's recent investments in AI and quantum computing, which could change the future of warfare.
For real.
I mean, imagine how hard it would be for the Pentagon to strategize against an enemy using an AI supercomputer to calculate decisions in milliseconds.
Dude, when you have AI and quantum computing, like quantum computing for the most part, as far as I understand, isn't really like that well defined yet. But once people like really start implementing like serious quantum computers with like AI capabilities, again, it's like basically endless. You have like all of this power, like processing power going into this AI. So, I mean, it's going to be ending up like AI versus AI in order to try and, outsmart that.
But if we look at Russia again for a second, their military has turned out to be much more disorganized and incompetent than we imagined before their invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. Still, they're definitely a force to be reckoned with nearly 1 million troops, thousands of vehicles, and specialized hacker units. As for other potential attackers, North Korea, for example, may boast that their nuclear weapons can reach the US mainland, but owing to their low budget and antique equipment, there's no way they could invade the entire US. Iran is a similar story, except that they don't yet have a nuclear warhead, although they're not far off. Realistically speaking, both countries use nukes to preserve the regime rather than actually use them against their enemies. Cuba and Venezuela are two other enemy nations in the US's backyard, but their troop numbers and military budgets are hardly enough to invade the United States. And if all else fails to stop an invasion, we shouldn't forget that America is a nuclear-armed nation itself. It has a triad of air, land, and sea missiles, which make it impossible to take out entirely. Land missiles are stored in the center of the country, and the sea missiles are in submarines, which are constantly on the move, hidden away without a blip on the radar.
Nuclear power too.
Nuclear weapons have acted more as a deterrent rather than a direct threat. You see, the principle of mutually assured destruction essentially means anyone who uses a nuke will get nuked back, launching a chain reaction of nuclear warfare, eventually obliterating Earth.
That's it. It's like the end of the world right there.
But just for fun, let's compare nuclear arsenals. Alright, so the US and Russia currently have around 5,000 nukes, with around 1,500 deployed at heavy bomber bases and on intercontinental missiles.
So I wonder if this is getting lower, because I know the US and Russia, we had the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So we're kind of trying to lower that number. I don't know if it's still going down, and I don't know if that treaty is still into effect, to be honest. But it was at least some attempt. At least at the surface, it was an attempt.
And then we of course have China. It has a couple hundred nuclear weapons, but none of them are deployed. Now, these numbers might seem high since they can literally eradicate humanity, but this is actually a low point from the peak of 70,000 nukes worldwide in the mid-1980s. What's still quite worrying,
they weren't as powerful back then, I would imagine, but
over 11,000 nuclear warheads since 1994, China and Russia are thought to be increasing their stockpile. But despite this, I hope you can see how costly it would be to even attempt an invasion of the US. Any hypothetical invasion would have to overcome the US's huge military and geographical advantages to gain any ground. While it is plausible that a major state actor like China or Russia could take out satellites and hack critical infrastructure, they'd also have to contend with the millions of well-equipped troops on the ground and a hostile armed
and they show one dude who looks like just miserable being in formation, and this dude whose helmet is like falling off the back of his head.
on the ground and a hostile armed
Most people probably wouldn't pick up on that kind of
stuff.
A
physical invasion isn't really a possibility, but what if America's enemies could get what they wanted without an invasion? Well, it turns out it's much easier to conquer hearts and minds in an information war than to win with soldiers on the ground. And that might have something to do with Russia's influence campaign in the 2016 US presidential elections.
Yep, I was waiting for that.
After a 3-year investigation, a bipartisan US Senate committee recently concluded that Russia conducted an influence campaign to help Donald Trump get elected. If that's not shocking enough, the report states that Vladimir Putin himself ordered the hacking of Democratic Party emails to be leaked over WikiLeaks.
It's like it's so clever to just like really subvert the entire country doing really shady stuff like that. But like, again, you would think, how are they able to like do and affect that much? But again, their cyber capabilities are absolutely like insane when you really think about it and see like on a global scale what Russia has done with their cyber capabilities. So, I mean, going for something like that where you would think it's kind of secure, but not necessarily like a military kind of focused, I guess, network or system. So maybe it was a little bit easier to target. I'm not sure if those like findings or whatnot are actually public. It would be kind of interesting for somebody to break that down in a video as far as like how they actually did everything. But yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to see that in the near future either.
FBI now has a warrant out for 12 Russian military intelligence officers it believes interfered in the 2016 elections. So this is a serious incident. A recent report by a group of intelligence agencies claims Russia tried to interfere again in 2020, though on a smaller scale. Whether Russia continues to meddle in US politics in the future or not, the damage may already be done as Americans increasingly report a loss of faith in democracy and government institutions. But that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Okay, just like dropping the ball like that and just leaving us to think about all of that. Okay. Yeah, a lot of really interesting research went into this. A lot of it, you can kind of, again, like seeing how much the US spends. Yeah, of course, that's going to be a pretty big deciding factor as far as like our sort of military capability. But of course, there's a lot of things that are in our favor, especially geographically speaking, and kind of just the way that our country is set up as far as like all the transportation and whatnot. But with that, sometimes with these videos, I do end up leaving with more questions than I kind of had going into it. But I definitely want to do some research on certain things that they went over, especially like that, what was that, alloy, whatever, that special material or that metal that they were talking about. I want to do some research about that and kind of see what the deal is with all that. But of course, if there's anything that y'all can add specifically that you know, or of course, if there's anything that I said incorrectly or anything that might have been like a little bit misconstrued in the video itself, definitely throw it down below because, yeah, of course, it's nice to not spread like kind of false information as well. Now, as an American myself, again, like I'm pretty confident that we use our military for the most part for pretty good purposes, like, you know, helping a lot of people out in the world. A lot of people will absolutely disagree, and that's totally fine. But at least me serving in the military, I know kind of what I've done. And I think generally speaking, the missions that I've been a part of were definitely doing a lot more good than they were doing, you know, harmful, negative things in the world. It'd be interesting to kind of know like what other countries think like our priority is as far as like the US and US military. Because working with other countries, I know a lot of them think we're like really egotistical and really kind of like big-headed as far as like, oh yeah, our military is stronger, we do everything bigger and better. You know, not necessarily the case all the time, especially with people who have kind of like worked together with the US military every now and again. But once you have like the soldier to soldier or marine to marine engagement, you can really see like, hopefully, there are some Americans that are like that for sure. But, you know, you can kind of find that everywhere. Hopefully they see that, you know, we don't necessarily have that sort of attitude that, you know, we have like all the weapons and all the power and influence and we can kind of do whatever we want. It seems like it's a very mutual engagement for the most part whenever I've been kind of a part of that. So, yeah, let me know if you guys have kind of worked with the U.S., if you kind of had those same impressions. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I definitely enjoyed it, and I kind of understand, again, with that title mostly, why a lot of people are wanting to check out this video and why it's kind of so popular on YouTube. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, of course, hit that thumbs up, comment, let me know what you think, and definitely consider subscribing so we can check out some more videos like this. And of course, recommend anything else down below so we can check that out as well. But that is it for this video. I'll see you on the next one.